thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. I really appreciate it. On behalf of the Washington, DC lawyer chapter of the American Constitution Society, I'm excited to welcome everyone to COVID-tutional law, gun regulations in the time of quarantine. Before I go through and introduce our panelists and our moderator, I do want to remind or inform everyone that we are also having another event next Friday on October 2nd. It is called Political Influence and Antitrust Decision Making. It's at 12:30. You can register through the American Constitution Society website. It should be a great event with Professor Spencer Waller talking about an article that he wrote and some of the recent developments involving political influence in federal antitrust decision making. But with that aside, I am excited tonight to introduce our wonderful panelists. First off, we'll start with the Honorable, please forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Chokwe Lumumba. Is that?
It's Chokwe, like an
Chokwe.
S, but you did much better than a lot of people do.
Well, thank you. The Honorable Lumumba, Esquire, is a lifelong community activist and the current mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. In 2017, he defeated 9 other viable candidates in the Democratic primary with a total of 55% of the vote, and then went on to win the city's general election by 93% of the vote, which made him the youngest mayor in Jackson's history. Mayor Lumumba ran on a progressive platform promising to make Jackson the most radical city on the planet. Throughout his tenure as mayor, he has had too many accomplishments to recount them all, but highlights have included the establishment of a strategic plan toward building a digital economy in the city, strengthening community oversight of the police, including establishing Mississippi's first policy on releasing the names of officers involved in the shootings, banning excessive force, and requiring officers to intervene and stop other officers from using excessive force and report any such actions to a supervisor, which in this time is very timely and appropriate. Preventing the state takeover of Jackson Public Schools through an innovative partnership with the state, and embarking on the largest infrastructure improvement initiative in the city's recent history. Improvements will address decades of neglect and include the paving of historic Medgar Evers Boulevard and other major streets, installation of nearly 150 updated parking meters, and road and sewage line repairs throughout the city. Thank you very much, Mayor, for being here. The next panelist is Professor Mary McCord, who is the legal director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, also known as ICAP, and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. At ICAP, McCord leads a team that brings constitutional impact litigation at all levels of the federal and state courts across a wide variety of areas, including First Amendment rights, immigration, criminal justice reform, and combating the rise of private paramilitaries. Professor McCord was the acting assistant attorney general for national security at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017, and principal deputy assistant attorney general for the National Security Division from 2014 to 2016. Previously, Professor McCord was an assistant U.S. attorney for nearly 20 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Thank you very much for being here tonight, Professor McCord. Our third panelist is Hannah Shearer, who is the litigation director of the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Ms. Shearer joined Giffords Law Center as a staff attorney and a Second Amendment specialist in June 2016. In 2019, Ms. Shearer coordinated the organization's response to New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. City of New York, the first major Second Amendment case to come in front of the Supreme Court of the United States in a decade. Ms. Shearer is also the author of Giffords Law Center's Post-Heller Litigation Summary, a comprehensive survey of Second Amendment decisions issued by state and federal courts since 2008. Before joining the Giffords Law Center, Ms. Shearer worked as a litigation associate at Munger and Tolles and Olson in San Francisco and as a law clerk for Judge Paul Watford of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Thank you for being here tonight, Ms. Shearer. Finally, but by no means least, Joseph Blocher is our moderator tonight. Professor Blocher is the co-director of the Duke Center for Firearms Law and a professor of law at the Duke University School of Law and the faculty advisor for the Duke University School of Law ACS student chapter. Professor Blocher's principal academic interests include federal and state constitutional law, the First and Second Amendments, legal history, and property. His current scholarship addresses issues of gun rights and regulation, free speech, sovereignty, and refugee law. Professor Blocher has published dozens of articles on these topics, including co-authoring Free Speech Beyond Words and the Positive Second Amendment Rights Regulation and the Future of Heller. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed moderator and let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Austin, for organizing and for the really generous introductions. I'm going to keep my role as moderator as minimal as possible, just to say a word on how we're going to proceed here. Instead of doing a series of panel presentations, we're going to try to keep a lively discussion here going. I'll ask a series of questions to each panelist, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll have time to address those at the end. With that, let me start right into the Q&A, and let me start maybe with a question for Hannah. This is sort of a stage setting question to kind of, give a sort of broad strokes where we are and what's happened with regard to guns since the onset of COVID. Could you just give us maybe a general sense, Hannah, of what we've seen in terms of, before we get to how the law has responded, gun sales and maybe potentially linked incidents of gun misuse or gun violence?
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks very much to Austin and to the ACS organizers and to my wonderful co-panelists. Yes, so to inform this conversation, I wanted to give a bit of background on two trends we've seen with COVID-19, and those are increased gun sales and also increased harms from firearms. The pandemic has seen a period of dramatic increases in gun sales. We track this through federal background checks. And so the figures that have been widely reported are from background checks. The number of background checks done on gun purchases has been spiking since February of this year. Some months saw over 1 or 2 million guns sold in the month, and that represents something like a 60 to 70% increase from the same period last year. Unfortunately, for our ability to track gun sales, this is an undercount, because under federal law and under the law of 29 states, there's no background check required for guns that are sold in a private transaction. An unregulated private seller that isn't a licensed gun dealer doesn't have to do a background check. And there's also no background checks on online sales of ghost gun kits, which are build-it-yourself firearms that you order and assemble at home. So precision is a bit hard to come by, but actually there was one survey where households reported that 1 in 20 households reported that they bought a gun in response to the pandemic. So that's a number that it represents, how many households are actually reporting that they bought guns in response to the pandemic. And unsurprisingly, a surge of this magnitude in gun sales during a public health crisis creates risk. And UC Davis researchers just put out a study that actually examined increased gun sales in the first few months of the pandemic and linked those increased sales to an 8% increase in firearm violence. I think when the authors were explaining and exploring reasons behind that increase, they noted factors that we all know, that this is a time of financial stress and hopelessness and uncertainty about the future. People are experiencing health problems, they're socially isolated, and so all of that can increase the risk of interpersonal violence. There's also a greater risk of domestic violence and violence within households as people are staying at home and are isolated potentially with an intimate partner who is abusing them and away from support resources. And then finally, the UC Davis researchers also flagged that fear and scapegoating over the pandemic could increase hate crimes. And I would also say that the same is likely to be true of other forms of aggression, violence, or vigilantism. And I know that we're going to get to that later on in the conversation. So I hope that those facts and statistics inform what we're going to be talking about next, and looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists.
Yeah, and actually I'll use your remarks there to transition maybe to you, Mayor Lumumba. So Hannah's given us a nice sort of 30,000 foot view. Here's what the numbers look like at a sort of a broad level, but you're in a position to see how this looks in Jackson since February, March, really since the onset of COVID. We'll get a chance to talk a little later about what you've been able to do or try to do in response, but could you give us a sense, just kind of, what it's been like with regard to gun sales and maybe gun violence, as far as you can tell since the onset of COVID?
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to express my appreciation for being a part of this panel and look forward to the contributions of everyone. If I hate to do this in the middle of a panel, but I just got to notice that my battery's about to die on my computer, so I'm gonna have to jump to that in a minute. But let me say this, the data that Hannah has shared is consistent with what we're seeing on the ground in our city. And I think that we cannot have this conversation in sincerity without addressing what is leading people to purchase more guns. I think that COVID-19 has exposed the fragility in our society, that people are one illness away from who don't have health care, from being impoverished, that when we have to shut down so many areas of our economy, people are vulnerable to the effects of that. People who are vulnerable to financial circumstances and socioeconomic conditions are having to make a choice to leave children at home. And so a lot of the crimes that we are seeing, especially around gun violence in our city, are being perpetrated by juveniles, juveniles who are not being directed in other ways. It is my view that every block will be organized by somebody. It'll either be organized by a positive or negative force. And so when we see such fragility in our society and the things that we thought were under some semblance of control, only for that to no longer be the case and it to be clear that that is not the case, then people grab onto whatever means of safety they feel is available to them. Unfortunately, I hypothesized that we would see increased violence. I hypothesized that people would rely a little more on guns, especially in the midst of a Southern culture that I am present in, that people often, when they hear of crime, they hear of danger, they run to the means by which much of that danger is perpetrated. And so we're seeing that play out, and we're seeing the job of those individuals who are tasked with our public safety become even more difficult. And we're seeing distrust amongst the people who are seeking those individuals who are tasked with our public safety, that they are being held in question. And so I think that all of it represents two sides of the same coin, that we really have to address the instability and the socioeconomic conditions which people face. And wherever you see high poverty, you see high crime. And so I think that we could predict this taking place because there have been so many indicators in various forms leading up to this moment. I'm going to jump out of your screen. I hate to do that. I know that is not how we normally would do things, but I have to save us or I will not be joining you anymore after this point. Okay.
That's all right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And actually, I'll use some of the themes actually that Mayor Lumumba just raised to throw a question to you next, Mary. This question of sort of insecurity and control and sort of resistance maybe to, for example, lockdown orders or just general social anxiety surrounding COVID-19 has manifest in other ways as well. And one of those, of course, has been a demonstrable uptick in armed assemblies, private groups protesting, as in the case of the Michigan legislature, for example, capturing headlines. You've been very involved in not just following, but involved in that world. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you've seen those developments play out in the last 6 months.
Sorry about that. Certainly, and like my co-panelists, I do thank the American Constitution Society for bringing together this convening. Now, just to be clear, I've been involved not in those armed standoffs. I've been involved in trying to bring, you know, the lawyers and legal authorities to bear to push back against that, because that is not protected activity under the Second Amendment. So you're right, spinning off of the mayor's comments, even before the pandemic, we've been seeing over the last several years a real rise in this private, unlawful, paramilitary, and really vigilante, unlawful militia activity. And this coincided, it's interesting because if you look at the modern militia movement, you know, it really sort of started in the 90s with standoffs against the federal government. So standoffs at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, Waco, Texas. And then it kind of grew and ebbed many times depending on who was in the White House and whether the perception of the unlawful militias was that this was a friend or foe. And by friend or foe, they meant really somebody who was pro an absolutist view of the Second Amendment, like most of the unlawful militia members are. And then they thought, well, they don't have to do so much work then. And if they thought it was a foe of expansive gun rights, then they kind of came out of the woodwork and had more public appearances. And certainly we saw that when Barack Obama was elected president, because there was this rumor that, you know, the federal government was coming to take away their guns. This administration has kind of been an anomaly because, and it's an administration of someone who's very favorable toward extreme gun rights, an absolutist view of gun rights, but who is aligned ideologically with many of the far right militias, particularly when it comes to sort of like anti-government, like the president himself being anti-government when it comes to a lot of government programs, certainly anti-state government when it comes to programs with which he disagrees. And so he's given the militias a lot of things that they can kind of grab onto as common enemies. Also anti-immigrant, if this makes sense, anti-fascist. So these created a common enemy. And so we were even seeing before the pandemic more and more activity where far-right militias would often come out in support of and really in what they would call protecting the rights of white nationalist protesters at events like the Unite the Right rally back in August of 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, and other similar white nationalist rallies. They would come in their full battle gear with their AR-15 weapons and extra magazines and combat helmets and flak jackets and combat boots and radio control and say, we're here to essentially augment law enforcement, but really usurp law enforcement by arrogating to themselves without any authority whatsoever when and under what circumstances to deploy lethal force. With the pandemic, there's been so many other things for them to coalesce around. And in terms of that sort of anti-government view, most of them have taken a very anti-governor view in those states where governors have imposed at the beginning of the pandemic lockdown orders, now mask orders, and we see a lot of really sort of offensive activity by these right-wing militias. And I'm saying right-wing because there are left-wing militias, there are far fewer of them. There are just straight-up anarchist militias, but the predominant unlawful militia form right now across the US is this right-wing militia. And so we saw them taking sort of offensive stands against what they saw as the tyranny of state governors with things like the March on the State House in Michigan and with anti-mask, rallies and events they've had around the country. At the same time, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the racial justice protests that have been ongoing ever since, we've seen more and more of these unlawful militias deploying themselves, self-activating, which they have no authority to do, into downtown areas ostensibly to protect property or to protect statues in some cases. And of course, we saw this in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Albuquerque, many, many jurisdictions, Louisville just last night, oftentimes with tragic results, including shootings and deaths. And so this is something that has been fueled, their grievances are different than the grievances that the mayor was talking about that are animating some other types to take or at least different than some of those grievances that are animating others in poverty to decide to take up arms, but do come from, you know, a dissatisfaction with where they are, which might be economic, it might be educational, it might be, you know, any number of things that cause them to coalesce around this militia movement. But it's very dangerous to public safety. It's intimidating of free expression, First Amendment rights, and it certainly heightens tensions and aggressions to the point where we do see acts of violence like we've seen recently.
I want to ask Hannah a question about the lockdown orders specifically as they apply to gun businesses, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask one follow-up question to you, Mary, on the militias. And again, I won't use the phrase "involved with them." Apologies for that. But that you've been following the issue closely and involved in litigation, I guess, involving the militias. How much can they claim? You were talking there at the end about tension with some First Amendment values. How much can they claim the mantle of the Second Amendment, given that we do have that word militia lives in the Constitution in a few places, but there most prominently? Can they say we are, as long as we're being well behaved, Michigan, nobody gets shot, no triggers get pulled? Can they say we are the well-regulated militia that the Constitution guarantees?
In a word, no. And that's exactly the word that they tried to latch on to, that word militia, in the Second Amendment of the US Constitution and also in most state constitutions. And what they ignore is that the definition of militia in the US code and in state codes is all able-bodied residents, usually it says male, but all able-bodied residents between certain ages that are available for the government to call forth in service of the state, so in defense of the state. Because at the time of the founding, there was an antipathy toward standing armies, and instead this desire to actually, you know, have instead people be ready to be activated by the governor in the case of the state's government, in the case of the US, Congress and the president, in defense of the state. But nowhere, not in any state, is there authority for this group of able-bodied residents to self-activate. In fact, every state has a very elaborate procedure for calling forth this group of able-bodied. So most states, every state has a National Guard, which is sort of, you know, a standing military unit that can be deployed for various purposes. Some also have another augmented force that they augment with, which sometimes they'll call like a state defense force or something like that. And when they need to add to that defense force, they have the ability under their state laws to call forth the able-bodied residents. But once they do, they become part of that state defense force that has to answer to the governor. And only the governor or the governor's designee can call them forth. So the notion that this right to exist and to be a militia is protected by the Second Amendment is wrong. And we know that not just because of the language, you know, the definition of militia and its historical context. We also know it because the Supreme Court has told us so. So in 1886, the Supreme Court upheld a state law that banned bodies of men from associating together as private military units or parading or drilling in public with firearms. 29 states to this day still have that statute. Others have different types of anti-paramilitary activity statutes. The Supreme Court in 1886 upheld that statute against a First and Second Amendment challenge, saying states have to be able to have the monopoly on the organized use of force, on military activity, and states have to be able to regulate and prevent private military units, and that does not offend the Second Amendment. In 2008, in District of Columbia v. Heller, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, the Supreme Court reiterated that holding. In that case, it held that the Second Amendment protects a private individual right to bear arms for one's own individual self-defense, but that it does not prevent states from prohibiting private paramilitary organizations. So thank you for asking the question, because I think the mythology about the Second Amendment is so widespread around the country that you see even police chiefs often thinking that these private unlawful militias have a constitutional right to do what they're doing, and they do not.
That 1886 case, if anyone wants to read it, is called Presser, and it's an interesting set of facts and worth a read. Hannah, coming back to you, it's another lockdown question. I think the intersection of guns and lockdowns, if you hold aside the armed assemblies, was probably most prominent in terms of headlines, at least, with regard to the gun store closures, which we saw in a few states where they were closed along with other businesses deemed non-essential. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened there, and specifically if there was litigation about it, how that was resolved?
Sure. So I think this is maybe a more conventional response by the gun rights activists who wanted to oppose measures that state governments adopted in response to the pandemic. They went to court, like many other groups, and challenged the stay-at-home orders, the lockdown orders, as they applied to gun businesses. There were challenges to gun store closures, gun range closures, limitations on concealed carry permits that were motivated by trying to limit someone having to go in person and apply for a permit. So all of those got challenged in various states. And I think what was really happening, first of all, not every state adopted this approach. It was really piecemeal, I think. And I also think that most of the restrictions were phased out earlier on in the pandemic. And right now there's only a handful of states that still have any restrictions on gun stores as they've reopened to other businesses with appropriate social distancing precautions. But another thing to note is that I think that the orders early on didn't specifically target gun stores in any way or gun ranges. They were swept in with many other businesses that state governors were deeming non-essential in the early stages of the pandemic. And then with respect to gun sales, they weren't being prohibited completely because some stores that were designated essential were still open and selling guns, like a Walmart, for example. I don't think there were states shutting down Walmart. So there was always a source to get guns. But nonetheless, these groups, along with many other groups, started bringing legal challenges, claiming it's a Second Amendment violation to limit gun sales at all, to close down gun stores. And I think initially the groups litigating these cases had high hopes for these lawsuits. They saw it as their chance to enshrine some kind of a right to increased access to firearms during a pandemic, during a moment of real instability and crisis in the nation. These lawsuits were pushing a narrative that not only is this a constitutional right that can't be restricted, it's more important now than ever. People are demanding guns now because of the pandemic. And I think that ultimately did not pan out, probably for a couple of reasons. One, there was no evidence that states were targeting gun sales specifically or trying to limit that particular conduct. They were trying to limit all in-person type businesses until precautions could be implemented. And so I think that the courts ended up responding to these cases by treating gun rights like every other constitutional right, saying that at an emergency time like this, when there's a public health risk of transmission, the government can close down businesses even if it affects constitutional rights. So I think it was an interesting issue that came up earlier on, and it didn't end up turning into any kind of judicial recognition of some kind of super right to obtain guns during a pandemic. And I think that would have been a very disturbing development if gun stores were given special protections, especially given what we know about the increased gun violence that followed the increases in sales.
And I want to come back later to the question you flagged there about what the long-term potential constitutional, that is, ramifications might be of the current moment. But first, I want to turn back to Mayor Lumumba. So what Hannah's describing there about the closure of gun stores or gun sellers, of course, does not mean the end of gun sales, because as we were talking earlier, there are other ways to buy guns legally. It doesn't have to be from a licensed dealer. In Jackson, what have you seen? Are there are reports in places of sort of the equivalent of gun shows, tent sales, sales happening through sort of alternative channels, which may be frankly less desirable than sales through gun stores. Is that consistent with what you've seen?
Well, first and foremost, the governor of Mississippi went the direction of finding the gun store and institutions where you could buy guns as being an essential enterprise. So his view was you needed food, water, and a gun, right? And so he made it apparent through his order that he wanted to protect that. What we see in Jackson is not only an issue of gun sales, but an issue of illegal guns. And the ability to open carry creates a very fine line of what our law enforcement can interrupt when they see someone openly carrying a gun and they have, in their view, reasonable suspicion to believe that they may not be in legal possession of that gun. What we see on a consistent basis, being that Jackson is the state capital, it is where we are the home of the state fairgrounds, and on a weekly basis, sometimes multiple days within a week, there are various gun shows that take place here in the city. And so it leaves us with an inability to really control that from a regulation standpoint, or even as we regulate any normal business as a city through zoning rules and such. We're unable to do that because it is state property right in the center of our city. And so, you know, as we dealt with the recent issue, since we're talking about COVID and the issue of guns, where the governor was critical of an event that took place with young people just a week ago and called it a super spreader event at a historically Black college. And true enough, they should not have done it, but there were young people doing what we all did when we were their age. And so we're pushing against the grain. And so conversely, you know, he then announces the start of the state fair, which brings tens of thousands of people into our city, and didn't want to recognize that as a threat. And so my position as mayor has been that when we have state property and facilities, that we have an interest in identifying that they pose a health threat to our city, whether we're talking about large events or whether we're talking about the frequent gun shows that take place in our community that ultimately lead to the oversaturation of guns within our community. To be honest, I'm not a person who is opposed to guns, but I do believe that there needs to be common sense regulation as it relates to guns. I'm not opposed to water and I need it to drink, but too much of it will lead to me drowning. And so we should have regulation and common sense approach to anything that we see in our society.
Let me continue this sort of theme about enforcement of laws and ask a question to you, Mary, about the ways in which, and I think this is going back a little bit maybe to our militias conversation, selective enforcement of laws, particularly regarding guns, has been a major theme of certainly a political discussion and of litigation as of late. I wonder if that's something sort of close to the work you've been doing, or if you have any sort of thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, so there are others I think who've probably studied more all the different ways that this selective enforcement has taken place, but I will note some things that have been very troublesome that we've heard in some cases anecdotally, and in other situations with a little bit more evidence, including video evidence and the like, and that is the relationship, sometimes the troubling relationship between law enforcement, whether it's police forces or sheriffs, who have a cozy relationship with some of the unlawful militias, and also even just with some white supremacist, white nationalist groups that don't pretend to be, private armies or private militias. And sometimes I think it's a range of things, from ignorance of the law, when you'll hear a police chief say, well, they have a constitutional right to be there. That could be just ignorance of the Second Amendment and actual belief that they do have a right to be there. It could be something more nefarious. We also see circumstances, and there've been a number of, anecdotal stories in recent weeks, including even just yesterday in Louisville, of police engaging directly with militia members. Either, in Kenosha, we saw tossing water bottles to militia members and saying, we appreciate you guys, as opposed to saying, not only do we not need your help, we not want your help, and your help is dangerous, but it's also illegal and you need to take your firearms and get out of here. If you want to be here engaging in First Amendment protected speech, that's one thing, but not being a private militia. And I note that in Kenosha, I do think there was also discrepancy in how the curfew was enforced, because those armed unlawful militia members were out past curfew, and others were being charged with curfew violations and they were not. We've seen that in other places too. There have been indications, you know, in other jurisdictions of giving it, you know, the thumbs up to the militia members. There's been email chains that show at least an effort by the militia members to coordinate with police. We don't always see the return email, so we don't know whether there was a return email, whether there was a return phone call, whether the police ignored it or what. So I don't always know whether it's sort of just a tacit acceptance of the activity versus like collaboration. I suspect there's a range, and there are folks, myself and others working with me included, that are very troubled by that. We want to make sure that police, local officials are educated about the laws, educated that this is illegal. So we've done a lot of sort of letter writing and phone calling and writing op-eds to make sure that gets clear, and then expose it, because once you do know that it's unlawful, then you've got no excuse going forward. And I realize that law enforcement can be in a difficult situation sometimes when you're in the heat of the moment. There's protest activity, there's hot tempers, there's opposing ideological views. They may make reasonable law enforcement decisions not to make arrests on the spot, heightened tensions. But let's then see, you know, the militias we saw in Louisville last night, not only marching heavily armed down the street, but also stopping cars and harassing people in their cars with no authority and while heavily armed with AR-15s. That is against the law in Kentucky. Kentucky has an anti-militia law that prohibits bodies of men from associating as military units, parading, drilling with firearms in public, just like the law upheld in Presser v. Illinois. And I haven't seen any arrests coming from that yet, nor did I see police asking them to move on or take their weapons back or anything like that. So it is troublesome for sure.
Let me actually sort of use that as a bridge to come back to you, Hannah. So there's the question of sort of how are the laws on the books currently being enforced? And there's another set of questions that might be the sort of what might the laws look like going forward? And is there a possibility that the current moment could lead to changes in gun laws, or legislatures paying attention, or it might change? You're closer probably to this issue than most of us. What's your read on the situation?
Certainly, and just definitely want to reiterate what Mary's been saying, that it doesn't always take new laws. Sometimes it just takes enforcing the laws that we already have and raising awareness about that. That being said, based on everything that we've been speaking about, there is much more that could be done through additional legislation. I think with respect to the militia issue that Mary's been addressing, more states could adopt limits on open carry. Only a handful of states right now generally prohibit the open carrying of guns without a license, or prohibit it even without a license. And cities could consider limits as well, assuming that they're not preempted from passing local gun legislation. And another area to think about is prohibiting guns at rallies and protests specifically, to protect the peaceful exercise of First Amendment rights, and then restricting guns specifically at polling places to protect voting rights. So kind of thinking more about location-based restrictions, which some states and cities do, but not very many. And I think that the events of this year have definitely revealed a greater need for those types of regulations. And then going to what the mayor has been speaking about, the fact that there's a surge in gun sales, but a continued surge in illegal sales at events like gun shows. The answer there is always to regulate private sales, which too many states don't require background checks on guns that are transferred at gun shows. Another area that people have been focusing on during the pandemic is that there's a default, what's called a default proceed loophole, where after 3 days, even if a federal background check is run, if the result doesn't come back, the transaction can go through after 3 days. And since background check systems have kind of been clogged up by the surge in gun sales and resource limitations with resources being diverted to COVID responses, there's been more of those sales going through, and that includes people who are actually legally prohibited from gun possession, but the law enforcement wasn't able to identify their conviction or other prohibiting factor in enough time to stop the sale. And I just want to add that there's lots of traditional gun violence prevention measures, stuff that my organization at least advocates for every year that I think are especially important to consider in a time like this when we're seeing increased gun violence and gun sales. That would include laws that restrict access to firearms by people with domestic abuse records, because there's such a dangerous link between domestic violence and firearm violence. And that would include extreme risk protection order laws that provide an avenue to remove guns from people who are making dangerous threats of violence. And those laws have been successfully used against people who are organizing militia activity, trying to organize white supremacists online to carry out hate crimes. And then finally, it would include legislation that funds violence intervention programs in communities and hospital-based intervention programs that provide direct services to gun violence victims. And those programs have been proven to be very effective in communities that are hardest hit by gun violence. And I think these programs are even more important now, even though unfortunately lots of states and cities are facing a budget crisis that's leaving them underfunded. So those are the policy recommendations I think are going to be especially critical during this time period in our country.
And worth noting that those communities that are hardest hit by gun violence have also tended to be the communities hardest hit by COVID, to sort of keep with our theme for today. I'm noticing some questions start to come in on the Q&A. So if you have some, please go ahead and send them in. We'll do one more sort of quick round of questions with the panelists and then turn to the questions. So if you have some, now would be a good time to get them in. The next question, again for you, Mayor Lumumba, this is picking up a theme that Hannah mentioned. She referred to preemption, which for anybody listening who doesn't know, about 40 states, a little more than 40 states have preemption laws which limit the ability of local governments to regulate guns. In practice, these are probably a stronger barrier to gun laws as a matter of law than even the Second Amendment has been throughout most of American history. And I wonder, from your perspective as sort of as a local government official, what have you been able to do? What pushback have you gotten when you've tried to take actions to address the gun violence issues that you were talking about earlier?
So I do lead a city which is housed in a state that provides preemption laws against local elected officials from affecting gun regulation. There is also law on the books that empowers municipal leadership in a moment of a declared emergency. And so I took that along with some legal advice as an interpretation of preventing open carry law for a period of time in our city. And, you know, we did that once again, hypothesizing that we would see not only an increase of gun possession and ownership, but more importantly, what we've been facing is the illegal possession of guns and the disproportionate effect that gun violence has had on Black and Brown communities, not only during COVID, but you know, in our everyday existence in this country. And so seeing that and being deeply concerned with that, we were led to that move. And you know, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a specific circumstance that I felt that we could no longer say that we just want to see a change, but I was called to action. It was after a 5-year-old girl named Queeniana Davis was struck by a stray bullet in a circumstance where some guys were in a shootout in an apartment complex. Another area where we see people disproportionately affected, and the privilege that we talk about when we're talking about social distancing in the middle of COVID-19 is not extended to people who live in housing units of that nature. You can't say that people should have just been staying at home because I had a stay-at-home order, because she was staying at home, right? And so I felt called to action because we've seen a disproportionate number of illegal weapons seized once investigation goes forward and we find out what has led to these shootings and seize these weapons. And so that is what led me there. Now, I am a recovering attorney, right? And after learning some of the things that were taking place as it relates to the open carry law and the national fight to push for a move for open carry to be a national, a nationwide law and policy, I realized that my order was giving opportunity for a conflict between jurisdictions or a conflict between circuits. And out of concern for the overall effort of being able to better regulate that, I allowed it to expire for the period of time that it was in place, thinking that you know, while we were well-intentioned in what we were trying to do to affect safety, the health and safety of our residents here in Jackson, that it may have ultimately resulted in something that we did not want to see.
I want to pick up something else that Hannah mentioned that's I think worth talking about, especially as we're looking forward to November 3rd, which is the question of guns at polling places, or gun regulations and gun use surrounding the election. And again, I'll give this one to you, Mary, because I think it's probably closest to the issues that you're working on. What do you think the major issues are going to be there? How well are we equipped to address them?
So, you know, I think consistent with the discussion we had earlier about some of these unlawful private militias taking it upon themselves to usurp law enforcement authority, we can already sort of see the movie playing out ahead of ourselves. We have right now the president and some of his surrogates seeding a distrust of mail-in ballots in the electorate by repeatedly day after day tweeting and making other statements about how they're highly susceptible to fraud, even though there is no empirical evidence of that at all, and experts from both parties have said so. We've seen him also suggesting that delay in counting the ballots means fraud, and frankly that anything other than him being declared the victor means there was a rigged election. That said, there are people on the other side who are also very worried that the election will be rigged, and that a victory for Trump would mean it was rigged against Biden. So we've got these tempers flaring, and this kind of rhetoric is exactly a dog whistle to the right-wing militias that would then take it upon themselves to say, we better go patrol the polls then and make sure there's no fraud and make sure there's no one voting illegally who's not qualified. And so my concern is that we will see some armed groups of individuals that, and maybe they won't put on their flak jackets, but armed groups of individuals who will probably stay outside of the perimeter zones that most states have to ensure there's no electioneering or solicitation within a certain number of feet from the entrance, but could be right outside that. They could be purporting to be patrolling, which would violate the laws of many states. They could be just standing there and try to avoid being labeled with unlawful militia activity by just standing there. So I think this is one reason that my organization has put out fact sheets for all 50 states. These are just 2-page fact sheets, which can be a front and back, which describes what is a militia. Again, all able-bodied residents that only the government can call forth. How do I know if an armed group of individuals is an unlawful militia? Is it protected by the Second Amendment? No. What do I do if I see an unlawful militia near the polling place? And then it asks people to document what they see and then to call election protection. And my organization, as well as a coalition of law firms donating their time, all of us pro bono, are available to help intercede, make sure local officials are aware of the laws, and litigate if necessary. Because we cannot have a situation where there's armed intimidation of voters who are trying to get to the polls. So this could violate the anti-militia laws we've been talking about. All 50 states have some form of anti-militia law, whether it's constitutional or statutory. Could also violate voter intimidation laws under the federal law as well as under local law, just depending on what the activity is. So I don't want to, cause alarm and make people afraid to vote, because that's the worst possible thing. But I do think people need to be prepared about what can they do if they see that type of armed activity near polling places, and have resources and realize there are people that want to help with that situation. And one of the other reasons we did the fact sheets also is to get them in the hands of law enforcement and election officials and state and local leaders who might not realize what their own laws against this activity are. And so hopefully can help to enforce that and protect voters who are seeking to go to just safely get to the polls.
Excellent. So we're starting to get some questions into the Q&A here, and a few of them go to the future of the Second Amendment. So let me ask one last question for you, Hannah, to sort of transition our sort of COVID and guns conversation into a sort of future of the Second Amendment conversation. Are there things that are happening now that you think could, like COVID-related developments, that you think could potentially have an impact on the interpretation of the Second Amendment as a matter of doctrine long term? And if so, what might those be?
Yeah, so the one I've been thinking about circles back to what I started speaking about at the very beginning of the panel. There's now a surge in gun sales, and those are legal sales because it's based on background checks. So as the mayor's been speaking about that, we know that that means there's also lots of illegal gun transactions happening. Those are hard to measure, but we're seeing them. But we're also seeing firearm transactions that are processed through the background check system increase. There's still a lot that we don't know about that. We don't know how many people are first-time gun buyers. We really have no way to know that these aren't just people who are stockpiling additional guns, like they're stockpiling hand sanitizer and everything else. But we can assume with 1 in 20 households reporting this is something they were interested in, that maybe gun ownership is increasing. And that has implications for Second Amendment litigation. And the main reason why is because many courts consider as at least a part of their Second Amendment analysis when they're looking at constitutional challenges to gun safety regulations, whether a firearm that's being regulated is in common use. And that comes from the Supreme Court's Heller decision, which held that the Second Amendment is an individual right, and the types of weapons, arms that it covers are those in common use for lawful purposes. And so that raises a ton of questions, but the court did seem to suggest that the commercial popularity of guns, of specific guns, but just also the act of gun ownership for self-defense or whatever activity people are buying guns for, is relevant to the constitutional analysis. And just last month, we saw a panel of the Ninth Circuit strike down California's restriction on extended ammunition magazines, magazines that hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition. And the court mentioned the surge in gun sales during the pandemic and used that as evidence that this is an increasingly popular constitutional right, and one that is maybe entitled to increasing protections. So there's a lot of critiques I could offer of taking that kind of approach to the Constitution, like letting the market share determine what's protected under the Constitution. There's that we don't have great data on who is buying which types of weapons. A lot that we know is reported by the gun industry, but really also we're in an unprecedented time. It's a global pandemic, and people are reacting out of fear and uncertainty. And is that really going to be something that determines constitutional analysis for years to come? That there was this surge of gun sales. I think that's an interesting and troubling question. So I guess I will close with that.
I would just note too that with the point you made earlier about gun store litigation, that was a moment where there might have been a holding about an independent right of gun sellers to sell guns, which is something that has certainly been heavily litigated, and there is some jurisprudence on, albeit not from the Supreme Court directly. Speaking of the Supreme Court and the last two comments, those being about the election and about the Second Amendment, let me ask the first question we've gotten in from the audience here, summarizing slightly, but the president has threatened that if Biden is elected, the Democrats will come to take your guns away. Given Heller, the Supreme Court's holding in Heller, and McDonald, which was the opinion 2 years later in which the court incorporated the Second Amendment against the states and local governments, is there anything to that claim? Is that just political rhetoric, or is there actually a threat that such a thing could happen? That's really a question for any of the lawyers or recovering lawyers there. Although Hannah, as a director of litigation, it might be most natural for you.
I think this is definitely a question I can answer. I will say, you know, that position, the reason why it's wrong has changed over the years, and it used to be wrong because I think even Democrats, it was politically impossible for them to kind of take that position. And maybe that's something that the mayor can speak to, how that's evolved, because it used to be, I think, that the barrier to adopting gun safety laws was much more political than in the courts. Today, I think the reason why this is an empty threat is not only because Heller and McDonald established, you know, you can't prohibit handguns, so we're at least going to have that. The tides are turning towards an even more expansive interpretation of the Second Amendment. And President Trump now has the opportunity to appoint a third Supreme Court justice who would certainly steer Second Amendment law in the direction of more protections for gun owners, but he's already appointed 200 judges to the federal courts in total. That's a record-setting pace when compared to recent presidents, and those judges are more extreme on Second Amendment issues even than judges previously appointed by Republican presidents. So like the types of judges that President Bush and Bush Sr. were appointing, not the same on guns as President Trump's choices. These are judges who are very skeptical of gun safety laws, and if there was anything close to everyone's guns are being taken away, that's not going to stand up in court.
I think that the case law and the Constitution make it highly unlikely and improbable, but I think that the spirit of the question strikes at one of the major issues here. The reason that we're not seeing an advancement towards the issue of common sense gun regulation is because it's that level of reductive thinking in the narrative that is portrayed broadly that you know, anytime someone says we need common sense regulation, they are framed as someone who is totally and completely against the idea of a firearm, period, right? I am a gun owner, right? But at the same time, I believe in the common sense regulation of those guns. I believe that I have to secure the gun in my home. I believe that I need to be educated on it. And I don't think that if I am suffering from some conditions, if I have demonstrated a reckless disregard or behavior in the past, that I need to be in possession of that. And so those are the things that we should be able to come to the table and agree on. But it is the continued perpetuation of that reductive thinking that is intended, I would say, is intended to steer us away from those things that, you know, people of goodwill, sincerity, and good common sense should be able to agree on.
One follow-up question then, also focused on the Supreme Court and the future of the Second Amendment. When the Supreme Court ultimately decides to grant cert in another Second Amendment case, should it apply a level of scrutiny approach, or alternatively, the test of text, history, and tradition advocated by then Judge Kavanaugh in his dissent in the Heller 2 case and by many other judges since then? Which of these two alternatives should the court go with? Again, a question, I guess, for any of the lawyers.
Well, rather than maybe make a sort of like, what should they do? Because I have my own personal opinions that probably don't count for much. I mean, I think that what we have seen traditionally combines what Hannah was talking about before, sort of looking at history and tradition to figure out sort of what guns, what types of gun rights are actually protected to begin with based on history and tradition. And if they're not protected, and I would say things like paramilitary activity and things that the Supreme Court, even in Heller, sort of designated as having a presumption of not being protected. Things like felons in possession of firearms, things like people with mental health issues, certain mental health issues being in possession of firearms. The court was pretty clear that based on history, there's never been a Second Amendment problem with prohibiting that type of gun ownership, and certainly no problem with prohibiting states from, no problem with states prohibiting private paramilitary organizations. So I think the question then, and I think it's a troublesome one for the reasons Hannah raised, are if you're going to continue to apply that test, you know, based on popularity of weapons to determine what is protected. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking of other constitutional rights that imagine how if popularity, I mean, we have an equal rights, you know, amendment, Fourth Amendment. If enough white supremacists got popular enough, would it mean that we no longer have equal rights? I mean, it's a kind of an insane proposition to be based, to my mind, on, now I am giving my opinion, in my mind, to be based on popularity. But assuming you get past that first, you know, analysis and determine that there is some protection here, that isn't the end of the story, right? There is a means and scrutiny test, just like there is for all constitutional rights. I mean, there's really not any constitutional rights that are absolute against any, you know, compelling governmental interest. And so that's when, you know, the court's been not entirely clear about what level, whether they pretty much rejected rational basis, but they're not really clear whether it's intermediate or strict, the Supreme Court at least. Lower courts have applied some sort of intermediate in most cases, I think, although Hannah and you just would know more probably about the individual cases. But, you know, there will be opportunities, I think, even with a very conservative court, although those opportunities may be more narrow, there will be opportunities, I think, for arguments that certain things, there is such a compelling governmental interest for public safety, given the, you know, real dangerousness of certain types of weapons, certain types of firearms activity that allows for some types of gun safety regulation.
And just as I'll take moderator's privilege and just say that one of the reasons I like this question is that I think this is these are the major stakes for the Second Amendment going forward at the Supreme Court. They're methodological more than they are with regard to any particular issues. And this seems to be shaping up to be the major fault line between those justices who prefer the test of text, history, and tradition, meaning exclusively text, history, and tradition, and then analogy when those run out, as opposed to those who think history matters, but also we should consider the effectiveness of gun laws in furthering certain compelling government interests. Final question, and this could be for everybody, those who are currently you know, teaching at colleges or universities, or who are mayors of cities, which happen to have, I think, about a dozen in Jackson. How should colleges and universities prepare for protest this January, if the president wins or loses, in states in which students can bring guns on campus? And I should say, as I'm reading that, one more question came in, so we'll take one more after this one. But the question here is, how should colleges and universities prepare for protest in states where students have a right to carry guns on campus?
I'm going to defer because I don't know. I think that is the great fear of the moment, and I think that fear or that question being framed with relation to colleges and universities is based on, I would assume, the person posing the question, where they find themselves. But that is the greater fear that you know, the underlying fear that I think many people have in this very fragile moment, as I started, a moment where people are facing socioeconomic challenges, where there is greater, you know, every time we have an election, it's the you know, the most important election of our time. But I believe that more people think that today than ever before. And it's because of these underlying threats where, you know, we're afraid of militias, as Mary has been speaking of. We're afraid of the conditions which people within Black and brown and underserved communities are suffering from. And so all of that appears to be creating a recipe for a war of sorts taking place in the streets of this country. And so that is something that has to be at the forefront of our thinking when it comes to our colleges and universities. And yes, we have 40,000 college students here in Jackson. And so we're worried about their protection like we are all of our other residents. And we realize the vulnerability of colleges and universities and schools, because we're having these discussions. And one thing we have yet to mention is the fact that we've seen so much gun violence in school shootings across the nation. In fact, we talk about Columbine as kind of the onset of that, but I'm particularly worried about that because the first school shooting of the modern era, which we know actually took place in Pearl, Mississippi, from Luke Woodham before Columbine took place. And so what that demonstrates is that we were already in a fragile place where things could take place in confined spaces like an institution of learning. And we, increase that threat with all of the things that we're talking about, from COVID to gun sales to political strife that's taking place.
Then I'll ask the last question. This is a good one, I think, to end on, because it shows, I think it brings to the surface some things that are hard about regulating guns, and the fact that this is not always just zero sum in either direction. The question, and I'm gonna add a few words to it as I'm reading it here. How do we enact or enforce common sense gun laws, especially those targeting people with criminal records or mental health concerns, without disproportionately disenfranchising people of color and disabled individuals? Throw that to anybody on the panel.
This is a great question, and I think it ties together a bunch of different threads that we've been talking about. This is something that I think is the problem with our current gun laws, and particularly the set of federal gun laws that we have. Because there has been no political will in recent years to adopt national gun safety laws, what we have is the Gun Control Act of 1968, which is the federal prohibitions on people with felony and misdemeanor convictions with a long enough sentence length and people who have been involuntarily committed. And that law is, that law disproportionately disenfranchises people of color and people with mental health disabilities, including people who had an involuntary commitment many years ago under, when our processes around that were very unfair and inequitable and unjust. And so that's what we have, because federal law hasn't evolved to take an approach that tries to identify who's actually at risk for carrying out gun violence. And states have really stepped in to try to do it better. And one example of that are the extreme risk protection order laws that I identified earlier that try to, that provide a process for people who have engaged in violence in the past and other risk factors that are actually more known to lead to an increased risk of violence. So it isn't just classifying people based on these broad categories of, do you have a criminal conviction or a mental health commitment, but have you engaged in violence in the past? Do you have other things placing you at risk? And so I think that those newer approaches are better in the better than federal law in that respect. But at this point, it's kind of it's been there hasn't been an effort to update the national laws that we have in this respect, and so there's a huge disproportionate impact that we see every day.
I would just, I totally agree with everything that Hannah said. And even though I was the one who pointed out some of these areas where the court has just presumed that that is a lawful prescription because it dates back so long in history, but it really points out some of the inequities in the systems that lead to the disparate disparate impact that was identified. I mean, if our criminal system was more fair to begin with, then you would not have that same level of disparate impact. If we had better mental health system, we wouldn't maybe have that same level, you know, with access to mental health care for everyone on a way that you know, regardless of the color of your skin, you're able to access the care you need, we wouldn't have those disparate impacts. And obviously that's way bigger than today's conversation, but I think this really gets at the heart of racial injustice in our system, basically that our system was built on from the time of the founding, that have then resulted in these sort of perverse impacts, even when you're trying to take advantage of, or not take advantage of, trying to just have some gun safety. And there certainly should be, you know, these antiquated thoughts about people with felonies are completely, you know, out of line with the fact that so many of our communities who have experienced incarceration are going to return to the community. They're going to re-enter the community, and we want them to be able to be successful and contribute to their communities and not be saddled with things like voter disenfranchisement, which is also a major problem, and other types of disenfranchisement, including gun ownership, when they have served their sentence. They've, you know, maybe they might need to meet certain criteria, X amount of time after prison sentence without a violent crime, you know, whatever, things like that. But we should not be labeling people forevermore based on really, you know, our history of racial injustice in this country.
Joseph, I will just join both the comments of Hannah and Mary, which I fully agree with them. Ultimately, as we look at gun regulation, we can't do it in a vacuum. There are other things that we have to be pushing for, like the restoration of rights for people. And you know, all of it is part and parcel of the failures of a criminal justice system, the failures of an economic policy that often leads people to be disproportionately engaged in a criminal justice system. And so we're not just looking, I don't think we should necessarily just be looking for criminal justice reform. We need criminal justice reconstruction. We need to totally tear it down in many regards and build it up, which is something that reflects more humanity in our society and the creation of a dignity economy, which focuses on the sustainable development goals that communities suffer from. That's what we're trying to build in the city of Jackson. We don't look at the success of our economy based on GDP and things that economists look at. The problem with economists is that they don't study people, right? They don't study, you know, what is the effect of your educational system? What is the effect of you know, people having adequate housing, you know, living in food deserts? And once we can start focusing on all of those things holistically, then the issue of gun safety and you know, the disparate effect on one community over another all fall in line.
I like the fact that our conversation, which began by talking about the intersection of COVID and guns, and we've now broadened the frame to talk about really the hard and huge work ahead. Fantastic discussion, fantastic questions from the audience. Thanks to all of you. I think that my role as moderator now is just to throw things back to Austin to wrap us up. But thank you all for letting me be a part of this conversation.
Yes, indeed. Please, again, thank you very much to the panelists. You were amazing. I found that very informative and very interesting. Thank you, Joseph, for moderating tonight's panel. You did a great job. I regret, I should have said this at the top, but I want to also thank the co-sponsoring organizations. The lawyer chapters for Madison, Wisconsin, San Diego, California, and Los Angeles, California. Thank you to those organizations for co-sponsoring. And I hope that in a year's time, we can have a rosier conversation about these issues, and we aren't talking about quite as many problems as it seems we have to tackle today. So once again, thank you to all the attendees. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the moderator. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful night.